now the one thing that I'm supposed to say, kids, you're dismissed. It's all yours.
Thank you, sir. I appreciate it.
Take this. Put this here. All right. All right, so there's something in my head. I just can't get this out of my head. Lonnie, did you say, when we were to pray for you about traveling and mercies and all of that, protection, did you say you're going to be traveling 15,000 miles? Like all of it driving? Yes? I feel like such an amateur. Like every summer it's like, oh man, we got 1,000, 1,500 miles. Man, kudos to you. That's incredible. It's really amazing. Amazing meeting you guys and seeing and hearing about the work that you've done. I can't even begin to fathom. But it's an honor to be here this morning and preach God's Word. As I mentioned earlier, the Davis Summer Tour to Appleton and Wisconsin is not totally wrapped up yet. We're about a month to 5 weeks in, and we're squeezing out last few days that we have here as that comes to a close. And after all the stuff that we talked about up here and what we've done this summer, you just think about this trip here, this visit, this time coming and seeing all of you. This has been an annual trek to Appleton. It's it's been going on for well over 10 years now. And do we have the slides? No? Okay, here we go. Awesome. So when we first started kind of making this trip, that's how old Caitlin was. That was one of her first times. And there she is with Yaya. And here she was earlier this year. She's 12 years old now. And I know, great. She looks gorgeous, like her mom. Nothing like me. And then we got Nate in 2015. He was just a little guy then. And then now here he is earlier this summer. You can kind of tell his whole leg is caked in mud from going to flag football camp. And if you guys think this is crazy, Carrie Donaldson, back in the day, when she was going to church here, and then here she is now, sorry, responding to something that I clearly said, let's do it a little bit better. Oh, there we go. Like a fine wine. I'm in trouble, but I don't know, it's kind of worth it. Got a few laughs. There we go. So Appleton and Appleton Free has really become a part of our family. Many of you directly enable us to minister to athletes at the University of Georgia and in places like Europe, Puerto Rico, Mexico, and Jamaica. Long before you knew me, you were doing the same thing for Carrie when she was in France and when she was on staff in Wisconsin and in Tucson. And you've done the same, frankly, for many, many other people, like the Smiths, who said back in the 70s and 80s, they said, you know what? We're going. We're going to where God sent us. Now, as family, albeit kind of a distance challenged family, we can ask each other some questions, right? We can be honest with each other. As I said earlier, it's going to be our 13th year in ministry at Georgia. And the ministry there is really unique. The athletic ministry there is really unique. We have staff such as my wife and I and my supervisor, Jonathan Irby, who are on staff with Athletes in Action. And we partner directly with FCA, Fellowship of Christian Athletes. And so over the years, we've had a rather large staff team. Everybody kind of gets to know each other pretty well. And they've picked up on a few habits of mine. Notably the question, how is your weekend? And evidently I ask this question so much that they are so tired of hearing it that they will start to make fun of me by asking me this same question. So it could be a Wednesday morning, and they'd be like, hey Davis, how's your weekend? Or it could be Friday, and they say, hey Davis, how was your previous weekend? Knowing that we're going to be going into the one ahead. But this one's a little more personal. And I want to know, when was the last time that you got into a fight? A solid, honest-to-goodness fight. Not a strong discussion, not a tiff, not a disagreement, but a fight. You guys might have noticed that we really like to fight, don't we? When I say we, I don't mean just us here, or the other people out there, or the people still asleep on Sunday morning. I'm talking about humanity. We have just mastered the art of warring, battling, insulting, of tearing into each other in all kinds of ways. That can be physically, that can be verbally, that can be non-verbally, that can be typing. People are really good at that now. And let's be honest, frankly, some things are worth fighting for, right? Or would you guys debate that statement? And then again, some things might not be worth fighting for. It was about 5 or 6 years ago that August of 2019, which seems like forever, there was something called the Chicken Sandwich Wars. Now, any of you familiar with that? Remember that a little bit? Okay, all right, it seems like forever, but August 2019, Popeyes tweeted about a new chicken sandwich that they were coming out with. They were all excited, marketing teams tweeting this out, to which Chick-fil-A responded with a subtle reminder about their original sandwich. So bun, chicken, pickles, love, right? Called it the original. All the love for the original. Well, look, you're Popeyes. You got a new sandwich coming out, so you can't act weak. And so they responded with, y'all good? And thus, the chicken sandwich wars began. Wendy's got involved. KFC got involved. And it was really funny. It was a marketing dream for those involved. And Popeyes ended up selling 2 to 3 months worth of sandwiches in like a week. They ran out. They had supply chain issues. But what wasn't so funny were the fights that broke out at some of these establishments between actual people over fast food chicken sandwiches. Which I'm going to argue, look, if you guys want to fight over chicken, you have to go to Jamaica to find chicken that's worth fighting over. Chicken there is incredible. Yeah, it's a real chicken. It's really, really, really juicy and tastes really, really good. But here, fast food chicken sandwich, I don't know, it's debatable. Now look, there are also the kinds of fights that people enjoy just watching. We're an athletic ministry, so you think about boxing and wrestling and MMA, various types of fighting for entertainment. Years and years, generations ago, the Roman Empire held something known as gladiator combat. And that pitted armed men against each other, as well as they tossed in some wild animals. So it's sport, it's popular. And so maybe some people aren't the ones directly involved in the fight, but they love watching a fight. Now, what about football? This is Packer country, right? We're at the University of Georgia. Who owns the G? Right? Who owns the G? Now, look, Green Bay. I don't want to get in a fight with all of you over this. Suddenly our support vanishes from this church. It has to do over the shape of the G. It is Green Bay. But what happens during a football game? People are fighting. They're fighting to move up and down the field. Fighting to take territory and score. What's going on the other side? People are fighting to keep this other team from moving up and down the field so they can't score. What happens with marriages? That's a loaded question. We have family friends of ours who talked about, some of the wedding gifts that they got a long time ago. And one of them was this collection of bottles of wine that coincided with each first in a marriage. And one of those was a fight. And so they went on their honeymoon. I think they were going overseas, and they wanted to do it really cheap. And so there were all kinds of delays. And so they talked about how they had a little bit of a disagreement. It was probably in the middle of the night in one of the airports they were sleeping at. A couple weeks ago, Gary and Kathy celebrating 50 years of marriage. We got together, all three of their kids. Applaud. That's great. So all three of their kids were out to eat. Three of their acquired kids were with as well. All the grandkids were there. And we're like, 50 years? Tell us about it. How? How did you get from wedding to now, from there to here? And they're sharing all kinds of wisdom. And one of the things that stuck out to me was Gary mentioned, he's like, we're not really good at arguing. So we don't argue that much. And I was like, wow, that's incredible. That's awesome. That's amazing. So fighting, arguments, wrestling with each other takes place in all different areas of humanity. And I don't want to make light of some of the ways in which we fight, whether it's historically or currently, because there can be an element of evil involved in it. Satan is great at manipulating and twisting until things can completely devolve into utter catastrophe. But there is a God who also enjoys a good fight. And luckily for us, luckily for humanity, God is really great at fighting in the right ways. And that's what we're going to explore today. Our God, who's a fighter who fights for us. Now, over the past year and a half, I've kind of been on this, Old Testament kick. And the more I read about stuff that happened in the BC, in the early AD eras, I just feel like, man, things change, but they're not so different than they were even thousands and thousands of years ago. It might look different, but the same things that people struggled with then, we still struggle with now. And I believe that to be true in the passages that we're going to look at today. Because at the end of the day, we got to have God fighting for us. But we're just not going to make it. Whether it's Pharaoh and his army that's chasing us, whether it's the Canaanites looking to go to battle against us, or whether it's something we're facing as a church, or a family, or individually, there's always something where God needs to fight for us. And honestly, we need to let God fight for us. Sometimes that means taking a step aside and letting God do his work. So we're going to start at the end of Joshua. It's chapter 23, verses 8 through 10. You guys want to hold that up? Chapter 23, verses 8 through 10. And it says, "But you shall cling to the Lord your God, just as you have done to this day. For the Lord has driven out before you great and strong nations. And as for you, no man has been able to stand before you to this day. One man of you puts to flight 1,000, since it is the Lord your God who fights for you, just as he promised you." I'm going to read that again. "One man of you puts to flight 1,000, since it is the Lord your God who fights for you, just as he promised. If we're going to take a look at the entire book of Joshua, just real quickly, you can probably divide it up into 4 sections. Chapters 1 through 5 is when Joshua takes over from Moses and he leads the Israelites into their territory that God had promised them. They actually head into that territory. But it's not necessarily as simple as that. There are other territories that they have to take. In chapters 6 through 12 is when the fighting actually begins. And so while Joshua was a key figure in leading his people in all of this, he and the Israelites were led by God in some seemingly creative and inconceivable ways. Now that eventually leads to chapters 13 to 22, where things kind of slow down. Joshua is in charge of dividing up the land, and there's this peace that God brings them. It's a period where the Israelites get to rest. And so by the time we get to chapter 23, the first verse in 23, it says, "A long time afterward, when the Lord had given rest to Israel from all of their surrounding enemies." So we end on kind of this peaceful note. And then finally, chapter 23 and 24, final thoughts from Joshua. At this point, he's in his hundreds. And look, I'm in my 40s. I like to convince myself that age is just a number. But when you reach triple digits, it's no longer just a number. If you're a believer, paradise is just around the corner. And that's true for Joshua. So Joshua is looking back and he's reminding the people of all that the Lord has done for them. And he's telling them, you guys got to remain faithful to the covenant that you've made. And he's reminding them, he's bringing them back to this idea that it was God who was actually fighting for them this entire time. Now, this is not a new role for God. He has been fighting for the Israelites long before this part of time. And for the Israelites, watching God fight for them wasn't something new for them either. The fighting that God does for Israel is numerous. It's happened, consistently over time, and it leads actually to a great deal of redemption. Initially, this first part happens in the first 5 books of the Bible. And notably, in part 1, you're going to see God chooses Moses to lead the Israelites out of Egypt. God's got a fight there. And then the next part of that is that God makes a covenant with them at Mount Sinai. So that's part 1. And then part 2 occurs really through the book of Joshua. And Joshua is a tremendous book of redemption that takes place. Mainly in chapters 6 through 12, we see God doing a lot of the fighting and redeeming people. But let's go back to the first part. Most of you know the story in Exodus, where God's people are saying, look, we're tired of being here. We're slaves. We need help. And so after some strong convincing, Pharaoh lets the Israelites leave Egypt, and he essentially kicks them out. And then he has kind of a change of heart, and he sends the cavalry after them. And in chapter 14, the Israelites are camping by the Red Sea, and they look up, and they see Pharaoh and his army just bearing down. All the chariots, all the key generals, he comes out in full force. Now, if you're in this scenario, in this situation, and you're camping at the beach, and you're trying to figure out what's going on, and you got maybe a fire going, and you got your family with you, and you got your people with you, and all of a sudden you see this coming at you. It creates a real crisis. And the Israelites lose it. In verse 11, they said to Moses, "Is it because there are no graves in Egypt that you've taken us away to die in the wilderness?" They also say, "What have you done to us, bringing us out of Egypt?" And they eventually conclude, "For it would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die." Not subtle. I appreciate the panicked sarcasm. And in situations like this, I guess it was easy for them to kind of forget the praise that they had prayed to God. But let's be honest. How many of us would be saying the exact same thing? I feel like I'm pretty confident in my abilities to freak out and blame someone else who I think is leading me to my death. But how does Moses respond? Does he get mad at them? Does he fight them? In verses 13 or 14, he says, "Fear not, stand firm, and see the salvation of the Lord, which he will work for you today. For the Egyptians whom you see today, you shall never see again. The Lord will fight for you. You have only to be silent." So Moses makes this bold, faithful statement. Get one last glimpse at Pharaoh. One last look at his soldiers. And everybody is chasing you. Because you're never going to see these people again. The Lord is fighting for you. And what happens? The waters part in the Red Sea. The Israelites dance across to the other side. And as Pharaoh and the Egyptian army try to pursue them, they're drowned. God fought for them. And God continues to fight for them. He establishes a covenant with Israel at Mount Sinai. And this is another part of this redemptive work that God's doing, at least in the first 5 books of the Old Testament. Now look, I'm not a biblical scholar, but I've heard about something called a suzerain vassal covenant. You guys ever heard of that before? No. Well, okay, a couple of you. Nice. That's awesome. Very good. So evidently in this part of the world, there were 2 types of covenants or treaties. One is a parity treaty that's between 2 equal parties. And the other one is a suzerain vassal, and that's between a greater and lesser group. The suzerain is the greater group, and the vassal is considered the lesser. Now, as the greater, the suzerain was required to provide certain benefits, like land, interesting, and in some cases, military protection. Now that is the agreement as long as the lesser group maintains its allegiance to the greater group. So, you're beginning to see how this could potentially unfold as time goes by. And so the pressure is on the greater partner to come through. And as the scripture begins to unfold, we don't just see this as, God and the Israelites, but we begin to see that this is something that God's going to have to deal with for everyone. This is something that, we're not going to be able to live up to our end of the bargain. And so we begin to see that unfold. But as we back up to Joshua, the second part of this Old Testament redemption, we see this play out. At first, the Israelites don't necessarily have battles like they did later on, but they do face a challenge, and that challenge is the Jordan River. Now, it's tough to fight a massive river. I don't know how you necessarily go about it, but the Jordan is one of the toughest. Its depths are some of the lowest places on earth, and at that time, the banks of the Jordan were overflowing. So, how do you actually get across to the area that you're supposed to inherit? Well, God fights for them. He splits the waters, and the Israelites pass over, just like they did with the Red Sea. But then we start to see God making his case that the battles to come in chapters 6 through 12 are really his battles. He's the one that is going to take on the Canaanites. Israel plays a role, but it's a lot different than what we would consider to be typical warfare. Chapter 6, they march around Jericho. And Jericho they are walled off. They are afraid of this group. They're not letting them in. And so how are you going to fight these people? Well, God says, hey, first 6 days, just want you to march around. Just march. And then on the 7th day, the priests blow the horns. Everyone shouts. The walls come down. And the fight's on. In chapter 8, after a setback in chapter 7 to the group of Ai, Israel regroups and listens to the strategy from the Lord and how to defeat them. And part of that, unconventionally, involved Joshua holding out a spear towards Ai's territory while the whole battle goes on. Later on, Israel defeats these southern armies, in which the Lord destroyed some of their enemies with a hailstorm. And the Lord also answers Joshua's prayer of allowing the sun to not set on Gibeon until the battle against the southern armies was won. That's amazing. The sun just stood there in the sky. Eventually, after all these battles, Joshua oversaw the defeat, I believe, of about 31 kings. Now again, Israel had roles. God gave them plenty of things to do, but their biggest role was to witness what God was doing, which was fighting for them. So at the end of his life, Joshua is saying, hey, look, guys, don't lose sight of the fact that it was God that was fighting for you and won all of these battles. Now, we looked at verse 23:10, but he also says something similar in verse 23:3, pertaining to what God did in these battles. Joshua says, and you have seen all that the Lord your God has done to all of these nations for your sake. For it is the Lord your God who has fought for you. You guys getting this? God's fighting for his people. God fights for the Israelites because they're the Israelites. Because God loves them. And because there was a covenant. Again, the key part in this was that the Israelites had to obey and did what God required of them. They're the weaker part in this partnership. And God was able to do what he did because generally throughout the book of Joshua, the Israelites really held to who God was. They really had a reverent fear of who God was. But honestly, the fighting has just begun at this point. And that's a relief, not only for the Israelites, but for anyone who has ever thought about their existence after this particular life is over here on earth. Each of the battles that we talked about this morning, and the ones throughout the Old Testament, and there's a long distinguished list, is a small preview of what's to come. And that's Jesus. Jesus' arrival on earth, even as a baby, was about fighting. And he was able to do, and he came to do, something that none of us could ever do. And that was deliver us from the punishment of sin. There's not enough fighting we can do now to overcome what we've already done. So our salvation was fought for by Jesus. And while we have roles to play in how the gospel unfolds in our lives, and sometimes in the lives of others, we're often witnesses to what God is doing through the gospel and has already done through the gospel. We're witnesses to this fight. And just like the Israelites, man, we got to tell other people about this. And we need to remind people about this. So I asked you at the beginning this morning, when was the last time you were in a fight? I'm going to ask you another question. Will you ask God to fight for you? When was the last time that you asked God to fight for you? It's always good to have someone on your side willing to go to battle with you or for you. Now, you've seen pictures of my kids. I want to talk about Nate just a little bit here. Nate, when he was younger, he was a little shy. You know, generally around older kids or kids his age, he was able to kind of warm up a little bit. With adults, he was kind of iffy. With Yaya and Papa, loved him. With Mom and Dad, generally he loved us. Other adults, he's more like, okay, just you talk to my parents. They're adults, you're adults. I don't need to be involved in this conversation. But we had a friend at our church in Athens who everybody just called him Gator. And Gator did life on the streets for a long period of time. But he came to know Christ, he became part of our church. And look, I would talk to Gator, Gator would come up to us, talk to us, he would say hi to Caitlin, Caitlin would be like, hi, how you doing, And then, but he would always say hi to Nate, and Nate would typically look the other way. You kind of want mom and dad to hand back. But when Gator found out Nate was in kindergarten, he started telling Nate, he'd be like, hey man, look, I know you're in kindergarten, I know you're in school. Any of those other guys in your class start messing with you, you let me know, and we'll take care of that. So this happened week after, and I'm like, okay, yeah, I mean, that works, Gator's going to come to school. Maybe we'll have an issue, but he begins to say this week after week after week. And sure enough, at some point, comes up to him and he says, hey, Nate, anybody messing with you at school right now? Do I need to show up at school with you? And finally, Nate smiled, kind of laughed a little bit. He's like, no, things are good, but thanks anyway. It's always good to have someone willing to fight with you, go to battle with you. And it's also good to know our God doesn't shy away from a fight. In fact, he's more than willing to enter into it on behalf of us, as he's done all throughout history. But how often do we really want to be in those types of situations? I don't. How often do we want to be in the types of situations where God has to come through for us? Where it's God who must deliver us, and it's God that has to fight for us. I don't like that stuff. You guys kind of like me? I kind of like it where, if I have to fight, maybe I'll fight. I don't? Yeah, even better. But what about just on a daily basis? How often do we invite God into the fight and ask him to battle for us in different areas of our lives? The mundane stuff. The stuff we kind of don't worry about, but we still know it's important. Or even the stuff that, we're not ever going to tell anybody about. Do we ask God to fight for us? What's your Jericho? What's your eye? What are the southern territories coming to battle against you? What are those in your life? What about the northern territories? What are these areas going on, maybe not just in your life, but the life of this church, where you want to have a role, you feel like you got something to give, but you look at the bigger picture and you're like, man, it's too tough. Are we inviting God into this? What if it were as simple as going to God with these things and admitting them to him and saying, I need you to fight for us on this. This is important. What if it was as simple as him saying, yeah, guess what? You're going to have a role. It's not going to be easy, but I'm going to give you some peace. I'm going to give you rest. And part of what goes on in your lives, in Appleton Free's life, is that you're going to watch me fight for you. And you're going to be able to tell other people about it. 1 Peter 5, 6 and 7 says, humble yourselves, therefore, under the mighty hand of God, so that at the proper time he may exalt you, casting all your anxieties on him because he cares for you. As God calls you forward, may you guys also remember what he said to Joshua when he first appointed him to lead the Israelites. Have I not commanded you, be strong and courageous? Do not be frightened, do not be dismayed, for the Lord your God is with you wherever you go. May God continue to be with all of you. May you cling to him, and may you allow him to continue fighting for you. Let's pray. God, I'm grateful for your people. I'm grateful for this church. I'm just glad that you like to fight. It feels so good knowing that even though I don't always do this well in terms of giving things over to you to fight for me, you're still willing to do it. I'm grateful for the gospel. I'm grateful for the life that Jesus lived, a perfect life, which was a fight. And he came through, he died on the cross for us, walked out of the grave. God, be with this church, be with your people here. I pray that you would keep them healthy, keep them safe. God, I pray that they would fight, you would fight for them, and that they would be able to look back years from now and be like, man, how amazing was it in the ways that God fought for us. I pray that others would live to hear about it and see about it. Be with us in your name. Amen.